The stars over Europe. Astrological interpretations of the Black Death. Ladies and gentlemen and aliens, welcome. Welcome back. Welcome to the Piscean X05 channel, where we talk about astrology in such an advanced manner for free that you can't help but subscribe, like, and comment and keep me in the algorithm. So, we're going to talk about the Black Death in this video. So, this is the great mortality and the question of meaning as our introduction. In the middle of the 14th century, Europe experienced a catastrophe so profound that it permanently altered the trajectory of Western civilization. Between 1347 and 1351, the bacterium Yersinia pestis swept across the continent, carried by fleas on black rats along trade routes from Asia, killing between 30 and 50% of the European population. Contemporary chroniclers struggled to convey the scale of the horror. Giovanni Boccaccio, in the introduction to his Decameron, described Florence as a city where the reverence of laws, human and divine, was almost abolished, where the sick were abandoned by their families, and where corpses were piled in churches like goods in a ship's hold. The mortality was so extreme that the event became known simply as the Great Mortality, or in later centuries, the Black Death. So for the men and women who lived through this catastrophe, the question of meaning was not academic but existential. Why had God, or fate, or nature visited such devastation upon them? What had they done to deserve this punishment? Was there any pattern to be discerned in the seemingly random distribution of death which struck down the pious alongside the wicked, the young alongside the old, the innocent alongside the guilty? Religious explanations were, of course, the most immediately available. Preachers across Europe interpreted the plague as divine punishment for human sin, calling their terrified congregations to repentance. Flagellant movements arose, their members processing through towns and villages, whipping themselves in imitation of Christ's suffering in hopes of appeasing God's wrath. Jewish communities were massacred, accused of poisoning wells. They charged that, however baseless, provided a scapegoat for collective terror. But alongside these religious interpretations, and often interwoven with them, ran a parallel current of astrological explanation. Learned physicians, university masters, and court astrologers turned to the stars to understand what had happened and to advise their patrons on how to respond. Their interpretations, preserved in treatises and chronicles, reveal a mode of thought that sought not to replace divine causation, but to understand the mechanisms through which divine will operated in the created order. The celestial chain of causation, Conrad of Mecklenburg and the comet of 1337. Excuse me. So, one of the most detailed and revealing astrological accounts of the plague's origins comes from the German scholar Conrad of Mecklenburg, whose Buch der Natur, Book of Nature, completed around 1350, represents one of the first natural histories written in the German language. Conrad was not a French figure, but a respected intellectual, educated at Paris and active in the courts and universities of Central Europe. His approach to the plague exemplifies the integrated worldview in which celestial, terrestrial, and human events formed a single meaningful pattern. Conrad traced the chain of causation that led to the plague back to a specific celestial event, the Great Comet of 1337, and this comet, visible across Europe for weeks, had been widely interpreted as a portent of disaster. In Conrad's account, however, it was more than a mere sign. It was the initiating cause of a sequence of events that would culminate 15 years later in the Great Mortality. The comet, according to Conrad, had corrupted the air. It crucial point, given the prevailing medical theory that disease was caused by miasma or corrupt air. The celestial corruption then manifested in a series of terrestrial disasters. In 1338, swarms of locusts invaded Europe, devouring crops and spreading contamination. From 1342 to 1343, unprecedented floods swept through Germany and other regions, drowning fields and spreading disease. In 1348, earthquakes shook the continent most dramatically on January 25th, when a massive quake destroyed towns across Austria and Italy. Finally, from 1347 to 1352, the plague itself swept through Europe, killing millions. Conrad did not present this sequence as a series of unrelated disasters, but as a coherent chain of causation, each linked connected to the one before and after. The comet was the original cause. The locusts, floods, and earthquakes were intermediate effects. The plague was the final and most terrible manifestation. The stars provided the grammar that made this sequence legible, transforming a chaotic succession of catastrophes into a meaningful narrative. This mode of explanation, which Heike Sam has termed epignostic, served a crucial psychological and cultural function by demonstrating that the plague was not random, but the culmination of a process initiated years before by celestial events. Conrad offered his readers a way of understanding their suffering that rendered it intelligible, even if it did not render it less painful. The stars did not explain why God had permitted the plague, but they explained how the plague had come about, and this explanation was itself a form of consolation. Let's talk about medical astrology and the plague, university learning, and practical response. So, while Conrad of Megenburg represented the chronicler's perspective, university-trained physicians developed more technical astrological interpretations of the plague, aimed at understanding its causes and, if possible, preventing or treating it. The medical faculty of the University of Paris, one of Europe's leading intellectual institutions, produced a famous consultation on the plague in 1348, commissioned by King Philip VI. This document, which survives in multiple manuscripts, exemplifies the integration of astrological and medical thinking characteristic of medieval learned medicine. Now, the Paris physicians traced the plague's origin to a planetary conjunction that had occurred on March 20th, 1345, when Mars, Jupiter, and Saturn converged in the sign of Aquarius. This conjunction, they argued, had corrupted the air in ways that made it conducive to pestilence. Mars, hot and dry, brought inflammation and fever. Saturn, cold and dry, brought putrefaction and decay. Jupiter, hot and moist, might normally have moderated their influence, but in this configuration it was overwhelmed by the malefic planet's power. The physicians did not claim that the conjunction directly caused the plague. Rather, they argued that it had created conditions, corrupted air, imbalanced humors in which disease could flourish. This was consistent with the Galenic medical theory taught in medieval universities, which held that health depended on the proper balance of the four humors: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile, and that this balance could be affected by environmental factors, including the quality of the air. The planetary conjunction had, in effect, poisoned the atmosphere, and this poisoned atmosphere was the immediate cause of the plague. This interruption had practical implications. If the plague was caused by corrupt air, then the appropriate response was to avoid breathing that air. Hence the advice, repeated in plague treaties across Europe, to flee infected areas, to burn aromatic substances that might purify the atmosphere, and to keep windows tightly closed. If the planetary configuration was particularly dangerous for certain individuals, those born under signs that were afflicted by the conjunction, then those individuals should take extra precautions. The astrological interpretation thus fed directly into practical recommendations for survival. The problem of theodicy. reconciling celestial and divine causation. The astrological interpretation of the plague raised difficult theological questions. If the stars could cause or indicate such immense suffering, what did this imply about God's sovereignty and goodness? Were human beings merely puppets of celestial forces? And if the plague was written in the stars, what room remained for repentance and divine mercy? Medieval thinkers addressed these questions through the concept of secondary causation. God was the primary cause of all things, the ultimate source of existence, and the ultimate author of history, but God ordinarily acted through secondary causes, the natural processes and created agencies through which his will was executed. The stars were one such secondary cause. They did not act independently of God, but served as instruments through which God governed the sublunar world. This framework preserved both divine sovereignty and astrological efficacy. The stars could indeed influence human affairs and indicate future events, but this influence was itself subject to God's will and could be overridden by divine intervention. Moreover, human free will remained intact, for the stars inclined but did not compel. A person might be born under a configuration that predisposed them to certain diseases or certain behaviors, but they could resist these inclinations through virtue, prayer, and prudent action. The plague, from this perspective, was not a blind fate imposed by indifferent planets, but a divine warning conveyed through celestial signs calling humanity to repentance. The stars revealed the presence of moral and spiritual corruption, just as symptoms revealed the presence of physical disease. The appropriate response was not fatalistic resignation, but moral and spiritual reform, accompanied by practical measures to protect oneself from the physical effects of celestial influence. Let's talk about the legacy of plague astrology. So the astrological interpretations of the Black Death didn't end with the plague itself. Throughout the late 14th and 15th centuries, as plague outbreaks recurred with terrible regularity, physicians and astrologers continued to refine their understandings of the relationship between celestial configurations and epidemic disease. Plague treaties routinely included astrological sections, advising readers on which planetary configurations were most dangerous and what precautions should be taken during threatening periods. The Great Conjunction of 1484, which brought Saturn and Jupiter together in the sign of Scorpio, was widely interpreted as portending a new outbreak of plague. When plague did indeed recur in the following years, the prediction was cited as confirmation of astrological principles. Whether this represented genuine predictive success or the human tendency to remember hits and forget misses is less important than what it reveals about the persistence of astrological reasoning. For those who thought in these terms, each new outbreak confirmed the validity of the framework. The occasional failure of a prediction could always be explained by errors in calculation, misinterpretation of the chart, or the intervention of divine mercy. The Black Death thus stands as a pivotal moment in the history of astrological thought about catastrophe. It demonstrated, on an unprecedented scale, the power of astrological explanation to render comprehensible events that might otherwise seem meaningless. It integrated celestial interpretation with medical theory in ways that had practical implications for survival, and it raised theological questions that would occupy thinkers for centuries to come. In the face of the great mortality, the stars offered not prevention, but understanding, and for many, that was enough. Now in my next video, we are going to go over the waters above and below, the Great Conjunction Panic of 1524, and the crises of astrological authority. And I hope to see you there with peace and love. Piscean out.